And we are rolling on November 16th, 2017, where we are about to hear a debate on what? Background check?
Yeah, I've really shitty handwriting, sorry.
Okay, well, I wasn't sure whether you were magazines or background checks. Okay. Background checks on all purchases, public and private. And going for the affirmative will be our well-known friend, Daniel Frank.
Brother.
My brother, Daniel, my brother. My brother, not my brother. Okay.
Who's timing?
Do you want me to say it or do you want me to give it?
Let's see.
Yeah, and say it real loud, please. Be obnoxious. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Daniel. So today's resolution is U.S. federal government should require background checks on all gun purchases, public and private. Definitions are self-explanatory, and I'm arguing from the affirmative. So whether the U.S. should require background checks on all gun purchases should be determined by cost-benefit analysis, grant adherence to whoever presents the best evidence. So what's the problem here? Private and public gun purchases are mostly underregulated or unregulated. Federal law, aka the Brady Act, only requires background checks for guns sold through licensed firearm dealers. However, private purchases require no background checks. You may know this as the gun show loophole. This means people who would fail background checks and can get guns, including criminals. Likewise, there are two types of problems. Number one, safety. Criminals can get guns and pose armed threats to society. According to a data table by Mother Jones that unfortunately keeps getting updated every damn week, 82% of guns used in mass shootings since 1982 have been bought legally. Legally. If you were to go down the list of shooters, you would find that a lot of those shooters would fail background checks pretty damn easily. And number two, lack of gun ownership monitoring. Lost or stolen guns do not have to be reported. According to the Washington Post, a study done by the University of Pittsburgh in 2008 found that 79% of crimes that involved guns in Pittsburgh involved guns that were not owned by the perpetrator. Moreover, more than 30% of the guns that ended up at crime scenes were stolen. On top of that, more than 40% of stolen guns weren't reported by the owners as stolen until police contacted them and told them the gun was used in the crime. Even more ridiculous is that for the majority of guns recovered, the place where the owner lost possession of the firearm was unknown. So what the hell is the problem? Why do we have this problem? 3 reasons. 1. Zero regulation for a private transaction. Under federal law, quote unquote, any person may sell a firearm to an unlicensed resident of the state where he resides as long as he does not know or have any reasonable cause to believe the person is prohibited from receiving or possessing firearms. It's really easy to get around that. Number 2. Inconsistent laws between jurisdictions. Buyers can simply go to places where there are less regulations. For example, Chicago is frequently cited as an example that gun control doesn't work. However, according to an article by CityLab, a study done by the University of Chicago from 2008 to 2012 found that 58% of Chicago's guns came from outside Illinois. Number 3, straw purchases. Straw purchases, which are a federal crime, is buying a gun for someone who can't legally own one or for someone who doesn't want to be associated with the transaction. According to a 2000 study done by the ATF, straw purchasing accounted for 46% of investigations and was the most common method of illegal gun trafficking. They happen because there's no way to check if gun owners are actively owning the guns. We need to fix this, and here's my solution. The U.S. shall implement federal law requiring of private and public transactions, including purchases and gifts. 1. The requirement of gun ownership and purchasing permits for owners and purchasers obtained after mandatory background checks administered by law enforcement and a mental health evaluation conducted by licensed psychologists or passed. 2. Restrict gun owners so they only can purchase ammunition and accessories that work only with the guns they own. 3. A standard of federal background checks. 4. Immediate notification to the ATF of gun ownership changes. 5. Quarterly presentations of firearms to law enforcement to check that guns are being owned by their legal owners. 6. Financial penalties if owners fail to present their guns, 1-year revocation of ownership and purchasing rights, and confiscation after 2 consecutive missed checkups, all with common sense exceptions, of course. 7. Permanent revocation of ownership and purchasing rights for owners who lose their guns and do not report them lost or stolen or have been found to use them in crimes. 8. Biannual background checks and mental health evaluations to check if owners are still legally and mentally fit to own guns. 9. Revoking purchasing rights and ownership rights and confiscations if it is reported that a gun owner commits an action that will cause him to fail a mental health evaluation or background check. And then 10. Freedom for local jurisdictions to implement stricter regulations. Now on to the means. The government shall issue a bill to mandate and set standards for requirements for ownership of a firearm. Established agency will be responsible for, number 1, running background checks and mental health evaluations. Number 2, monitoring firearm transactions. Number 3, monitoring gun ownership. And number 4, enforcing financial penalties and revoking gun ownership when necessary. So will the solution work? 4 reasons it will. The solution establishes a national standard requirement of gun ownership. 2, the solution mandates initial and periodic background checks and mental health evaluations, which will stop the legally and mentally unfit from owning guns. 3, mandatory periodic presentation of guns allows for the monitoring of gun ownership. 4, threat of revoking ownership and purchasing rights and financial penalties will make sure guns are in possession of their owners. Now, you're probably wondering, where the hell is the evidence? Well, here it is. Although gun studies are scarce, there's evidence out there that background checks work. According to the Giffords Law Center in 2012, background checks blocked over 190,000 prohibited persons from getting access to firearms, including 82,000 felons, or roughly 225 felons every year. Advantages. 1, the solution establishes national requirements to own a gun. 2, it allows for law enforcement to monitor gun ownership. 3, it allows local jurisdictions to make regulations stricter. 4, it ensures gun owners are legally and mentally fit to own a gun. And 5, it allows for revoking of ownership and purchasing rights and confiscation if owners commit actions that would cause them to fail background checks or mental health evaluations. And now on balance, which outweighs? Well, it's evident that the plan to mandate national requirements for gun ownership that include background checks and penalties for gun owners who fail to present and keep track of their guns will help law enforcement keep track of guns and prevent them legally and mentally unfit from owning their gun.
I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
And now
Thank
stand
you.
open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Do you have to wear the coat?
No.
They lose it. Stand more in the middle, please. Move to your right, Daniel. Thank you. Good.
Okay. So you mentioned that in deciding like who gets a gun, you would decide who's mentally fit. Who's going to decide that? Is it the federal government's responsibility or health professionals?
Oh, I did say licensed psychologist. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Right.
How's that?
Okay. What was your current definition of mentally unfit?
Admittedly, I have no definition for that, but mental health evaluations check for things like schizophrenia or just things that would cause a red flag. This person has a history of, I don't know, you get the idea.
Right. Would you say that the definition that kind of goes with your brief is more broad or narrower?
It's very broad and for good reasons.
Okay. And lastly, what's the first step in implementing this plan into the status quo, like with the background checks that are already in place?
Well, some states already have background checks, like here in California, and we just need to follow what's already been done. So there's ways to do this. The ATF is a great organization, but obviously they don't require anybody to do background checks. So if we take what California does and just tell the ATF to do that, it's cut and dry simple.
So you think that the federal policy on background checks should just be a bigger version of what the states and the local levels do?
Yes.
Okay.
So just a flat national standard.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay. Chair will now recognize the leader of the opposition, Mr. Jerry Jones, who will oppose the proposition that we should conduct background checks on all gun purchases, public and private.
Okay.
Dan, you can move to the right more. You're in the picture. Thank you.
All right. Hi, my name is Jared.
Hi, Jared.
And today I'm going to be discussing the topic: the United States government should conduct background checks on all gun purchases, and I'm going to be arguing from the negative. So I had a lot of definitions in this brief, but the ones that I wanted to focus on: conduct background checks. I'll define background check as limited to screening an individual for the criteria specified in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, of which include, and then there's some criteria, but the ones I want to focus on are a person adjudicated a mental defective or involuntary committed to a mental institution or incompetent to handle his own affairs, including dispositions of criminal charges of, or found not guilty by reason of insanity or found incompetent to stand trial. So what is the problem? The problem is that we've had mass shootings so often and have found no effective way of curbing their frequency. That's the true issue that's being discussed here. My opponent would argue that his solution would decrease the frequency of mass shootings or gun violence, but I will prove that this is not the case. I will, for my criteria statement, the criteria for asserting the truth will be a preponderance of evidence and quality of evidence in favor of protecting the rights of the individual. So the NICS background check criteria only strikes at the surface of the problem. Currently, the database is populated with gun-related health data, but this data is only used for one thing, either to permit or to restrict the acquisition of a firearm. None of this data has been used for anything else, hasn't been used to develop any development or of an understanding of gun violence as a public health issue, which we believe is a problem. Because mental illness is one of the criteria in the NICS background check, conducting mandatory background checks on all gun purchases has the potential to further stigmatize mental illness, serving as a deterrent to those who might want to seek treatment. And people who may be suffering from mental illness will have one more reason not to volunteer for treatment out of fear that he or she may no longer have the right to own a gun for self-defense. There's not necessarily a correlation between mandatory universal background checks and decreased gun violence. There's a false assumption that background checks are associated with reduced crime when in fact it may relate to reductions in certain types of crimes but increase in other types of crimes. So how big is the problem? According to MassShootingTracker.org, an organization that gathers statistics on any event where 4 or more people are shot, there have been 391 mass shootings in 2017 alone. Why do we have this problem? Many policymakers are focused on the band-aid solution of background checks rather than addressing the deeper socioeconomic surgery that must take place to decrease violent crime. Matthew Lang demonstrates in his research, which featured in a February 2016 Southern Economic Association journal, that background checks show little evidence of providing a substantial decrease in crime. Since 2007, quote, "Since 2007, the background check rate has nearly doubled and there has been a substantial increase in gun manufacturing and presumably sales of firearms. Over the same time period, both property and violent crime rates have decreased. This is not evidence of a causal negative relationship between guns and crime, but it does suggest that the underlying reason for criminal activity likely extends beyond the access of firearms." So if policymakers are concerned with reducing violent activity, removing firearms from potential criminals is only one piece of the puzzle. So many of the criteria and background checks are not accurate predictors of future violence. We continue to use outdated and irrelevant parameters in our background checks. So what is the solution? We need to redefine our current criteria and background checks and not expand a flawed system. Disqualifying law-abiding citizens from their Second Amendment right because of a mental illness is simply a cop-out. Background checks in many cases have insignificant or even adverse effects towards the rates of gun violence. In a recent study by Mark Guise, analyzing the effects of background checks on gun violence, he and his colleagues found that the results still suggested that state and federal dealer background checks reduced gun-related murders, but that state-level private sales background checks were associated with an increase in murder rates. And looking only at private sales background checks during the Brady Act period, it was found that background checks were not significantly related to gun-related murder rates. Given the results of the present study, it does not appear that expanding the Brady Act to cover private sales would significantly reduce gun-related murders. So will the solution work? As I have shown earlier in this brief, it is clear that simply expanding our current procedures of background checks will not be significantly advantageous to our goal of reducing gun violence. However, by further developing our criteria for existing background checks, we may be able to better recognize individuals who could be potentially harmful, while also ensuring the vast majority of citizens can exercise their Second Amendment rights. Advantages: better procedures for identifying potentially violent individuals, less stigma on the mentally ill, and I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Thank you so much. Click, click, click.
So did you get my brief? Are you ready?
Look at me, I'm the one to persuade. Thank you.
Start over. Okay, so did you get my brief I emailed you yesterday?
I think so.
Okay, so did you see my definition for background
Okay,
checks?
look at here. This is the audience. This is an act of persuasion. Jared will never change his mind. He's playing a game with you.
Okay,
He's
so
agreed not to change his mind. So don't even bother looking at him. He's just not going to change his mind.
I just want to double check if you got my brief. So did you get my brief or not yesterday?
Yes.
Yes, you got it.
Did you see my definition? Did you see my definition for background checks?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so I'm going to read it to everybody just so we're all on the same page. Background checks are the process of retrieving information from records such as commercial, criminal, and financial records to verify if a person is qualified. So we're not just talking about criminal background checks here, we're talking about a lot more background checks. And so now on to what you talked about. So you say that expanding background checks will not cause a reduction in crime, et cetera, et cetera.
I said that it could potentially decrease certain types of crime, but it could also potentially increase other types of crime.
Okay, so would you argue that it would be better to have background checks in place to prevent felons from getting their arms all across the United States rather than not?
Absolutely. I don't think that we should abolish the background checks at all. I just think that it's a flawed system and shouldn't be implemented at a larger scale if it's not working properly at the local and state levels.
Well, if you agree that felons shouldn't be having guns they shouldn't otherwise be having, then wouldn't you argue that a national standard would be the best way to ensure consistency across the board?
I don't think it's necessarily true that just because there are background checks that prevent people from getting firearms legally doesn't mean that they don't have other ways of getting them.
Oh, okay. Time's okay.